It's recording. I'll open the share tray. Oh, wrong thing. Okay, perfect. So we are ready for class. Welcome to class. We've got a lot to go through. I was going forward into chapter 10 and 11 and 12 for basically all the chapters for this unit, and there is quite a lot of things to cover. We may end up having to skip some topics as we go through, just with the time that we have in class, with questions and things, and that's all right. So I definitely want to get to some of the activities that we have planned in these different units, because I think a lot of them are useful, especially for students who are just coming out of adolescence and in early adulthood, because that's what these chapters are about, are adolescence, and then we jump into early adulthood. So hopefully it's all really applicable to all of the students in the class. So the first thing I will talk about is one thing that was skipped over last time, is sexual minority attitudes and behaviors, basically the development of sexual orientation in adolescence, and how that's different and really in many ways the same to heterosexual attractions. So let's jump into that. Let's make sure everything's working right. Cool. Okay. So with this, attraction to same-sex or identifying as LGBTQ+ generally occurs in adolescence is the most common time, but this can also happen in early adulthood, or you might even know people who have come out in late adulthood. So, but adolescence is typically the most common time, but emerging adulthood or early adulthood is the next most common time. This is also one of the first times that adolescents are tending to test out different sexual experiences. So whether this be heterosexual or not. So typically this is where sexual experiences are tried out first. With this, there are not so many LGBTQ+ relationships in adolescence. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why that might be. And then more relationships come in about emerging adulthood. And a lot of that is just down to the fact that, say you're in a high school of 400 people. So that might mean that, let's say, about 5 to 7% of the population of that high school. I mean, some of your high schools are probably a lot larger than mine was. But mine was like 400 to 600 people, depending on the year. So with that, if you take 5 to 7% of those people, that's not a whole lot of numbers of people as potential dating partners. So for adolescents, a lot of them have sexual experiences in adolescence, but don't have LGBTQ+ relationships until early adulthood, college, where kind of their dating pool gets bigger, essentially. The contexts change, so they have more opportunities to meet other people. So with that being said, the total percentage of people who are LGBTQ+ in the world is still something to be clarified, but most of the more reliable studies say it's somewhere between 3 and 7%, though I have seen as high as 10% and as low as 2%, so somewhere around 5, somewhere around 7%. But part of this is also due to the fact that in many places in the world, and even in the US, the stigma still exists for being LGBTQ+. So with that being said, it might be a little higher than these numbers suggest, or they might be fairly accurate. Again, same kinds of problems with asking adolescents about their sexual behaviors. If you're nervous about people finding out about your drug use or sex behaviors, you might lie about it. If you're worried about stigma about this, you also might lie about it. So good methods can kind of reduce that. That's why I say some of the more reliable studies show around 5%. Hopefully those studies are getting a pretty good picture, but still something to be investigated. With that, people have been researching the development of sexual orientation for a long time. So obviously first, probably not surprising, focused on heterosexual development. But researchers more recently have looked at genetics, biology, which includes hormones, brain chemistry, structures of the brain as well, in relation to the development of the sexual identity or sexual orientation. So cognitive factors, environmental and social factors. So there's been a lot of research here, and so there are some clear pictures. Mostly, one interesting finding biologically is that there might be a critical period of influence while children are in the womb, essentially. So some specific hormones might seem to be correlated, but obviously this isn't an ethical thing to experiment. You can't take 500 women who are pregnant and say, hey, for you 250, we're going to give an extra dose of hormones at this point in time. And then you as the control group, you're not going to get that dose of hormones to then see how that pans out. So again, this is correlational research. So correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, but it can point to some things that could possibly be the cause. So that's within the womb. There might be a critical period in about the 2nd to 5th month after conception. So one interesting finding, interesting study that was done early on was giving gay men male hormones. So the idea there was that would make them more masculine and then maybe attracted to women. And that turned out not to be the case. It made their sexual desire increase for their own sexual orientation, which is kind of funny reading over the paper because as you read over these original studies and also the news reports, a lot of people kind of were trying to essentially cure homosexuality. And so what they ended up doing with the hormone treatment is having them do more of the behaviors that they were not really excited about them doing, which I find kind of ironic. And yeah, I just find it ironic. So with that, there have been a lot of genetics and twin studies. So with that, there's about 35% of the variation we see. So in men and about 19% of the variation we see in women can be attributed to genetics. So what that means, I'll put that in another way. So if you have two twin men and one is gay, about 35% of the time, their twin sibling will also be gay. So there's probably some genetic component there. That's a lot higher than we would expect just based on general population on average. So like we said, there's probably around 5 to 10% of people who are LGBTQ plus in the population. So having about 35% of the time the sibling is also gay, that suggests that, hey, there's probably some factors there that are contributing, even though not the entire cause there. So that's what I mean when I say about 35% of the variation, or about 19% of the variation. So if you've got two twins who are women, about 19% of the time, the twin will also have that same orientation. So with this, it's really interesting that while it's, I guess historically it was seen as such a different orientation, the development of these sexual orientations starts and kind of progresses exactly the same way as any other sexual orientation. So this attraction to the same sex or any genders starts in childhood. So, and then you can kind of trace that and look back at that maybe as an adult after you realize your identity and say, oh, well, this is, I can see like, oh, I had a crush on this person or things like that. And that's a really common experience for everybody. Basically in early childhood, around the ages of like 7, 8, 9 is really when we can see attraction to whatever gender's starting. So it can happen a little earlier or a little later as well. So basically normative development, that's when sexual orientation kind of begins to be seen in behaviors and things like crushes and things like that. So it's really normative that way. So with that, it can also start in adolescence and be more abrupt, especially if a person's in a context where that's just absolutely not an option for them, if it's not even like part of their world or thinking about the way things are. So there's also a lot of factors with early reinforcement and experiences. If you have more potential opportunities to have interactions with the opposite sex versus the same sex, whether you have attractions or not, it might make it slightly more likely that you would be anywhere on that spectrum because of the reinforcement and the experiences that you have throughout later childhood. So this leads us to the question of being born that way. So this is one thing I really like to get across in all my psychology classes where we talk about sexual orientation. Oh, sorry, I see a hand and it didn't give me any kind of ding. Sorry about that. So go for it, Daniela, and I hope you didn't have your hand up for a long time.
No, I was for a long time. No, I was just gonna share something. I have a twins cousins, and they're girls, and they're 13 now, and they started like in a new school like 2 years ago, and they made friends with people that are like gay, and they start like talking to them like, oh, it's normal, like you can love anyone and blah blah blah. And so they start like, okay, so it's normal. So they start like trying. So one of them got a girlfriend, and then her father found out and got really pissed at her, and they broke up. But I think there was some influence there too, because before they never thought about it.
Yeah, really good example there. Thank you for sharing that. And that's one of the things I was talking about here with the environmental and social factors. That if that's not even part of the language or your ideas or discussion, you might not even in childhood, early childhood, middle childhood, late childhood, or even into adolescence, you might not even consider any kind of thoughts you have towards someone of any gender to be part of your sexual orientation. That might not even enter your mind because it's not part of your cognitive schema. So that is actually a pretty common thing for people who are LGBTQ plus to have not even realized it until later on when they learn that that's an option, essentially. Similar to, was it this class or is that my 101 class? I think we watched a video about the transgender girl who was in kindergarten and how the only options that she was given were a boy line or a girl line in school. And so it was framed that way. There was no framing that you could be anything other or there were any other options on the gender spectrum. So similar to that, if there's not that opportunity or that thought even in your head that that's a possibility, this is also another reason that we wonder, is the number of LGBTQ plus people in the world a little higher if they knew it was an option, things like that. But yeah, really good example, and also a good example of the kind of reinforcement or lack of reinforcement. What was that? So yeah, so that seems like a lack of reinforcement from parents getting mad about someone having a girlfriend. So that might be discouraging and lead that person not to act out in, or maybe act out is the, not to act on those same feelings in the future. So really good example, really relevant to the discussion as well. So with that being said, are people born this way? Are people born with their sexual orientation? And so this is a really common thing to hear from people talking about rights for people who are LGBTQ plus. But as scientists and as developmental scholars, people that are learning about development, I want to make the point that it's a little more complicated than just being born that way. So we talked about there's a little bit of genetic component, there's some socio-emotional components, there's some environmental components that lead to that being an option or happening, but that's not all. So I guess the main point is reducing it to saying someone's born that way. While it can be useful for some arguments that we're trying to make to get people the rights that they deserve, it's not the end all be all. I'm not doing as good of a job discussing it as this researcher who researches it a lot. So we probably won't watch this whole video, but this researcher has been doing quite a lot of studies on people who are LGBTQ and still is doing some longitudinal studies now. So I heard her speak actually at Claremont Graduate University. It was really interesting to hear some of the specific examples of people that she's followed, both of all kinds of sexual orientations that she's been following since they were, it was either 16 or 18. It was really pretty early on in their lives. And then she's been following them for about 30 years now and measuring them every once in a while, having them like write down in journals new or different sexual experiences or attractions that they might have, and see how fluid sexual orientation really is. So let's watch this. And she does a really good job about talking about why the born this way argument isn't the best way to think about it, especially for us as scientists.
True or false? Sexual orientation is something you're born with. Chances are that if you support LGBT rights, you said true. Surveys have found that people who view sexual orientation as an innate trait, like eye color, tend to be more supportive of LGBT rights. Now, why is that? When asked, folks typically say, well, it's just wrong to discriminate against someone for how they're born. It's like ethnic discrimination. Makes sense. So for years, the Born That Way argument has been used to promote LGBT equality. Lady Gaga's song, Born That Way, even became an unofficial anthem of the gay community. But there are three problems with the Born That Way argument. First, it's not scientifically accurate. Second, it's not legally necessary. But third, and most important, it's actually unjust. And it's time to retire that argument for LGBT equality. Now, my passion for this issue stems from my own research on sexual orientation. Over 20 years ago, I started a study tracking over time 100 women with different sexual identities. And over the years, I was frankly surprised by some of the changes that they went through. Some of the lesbians ended up involved with men. Some of the heterosexual women ended up getting involved with women. And when these sorts of things would happen, women would say to me that they thought there must be something wrong with them, since their experiences didn't fit the conventional wisdom that sexual orientation is fixed at birth. So that brings us to the first problem with the Born That Way argument, that it's not scientifically accurate. Now, sexual orientation does often express itself very early and very consistently, but lots of times it doesn't. And it breaks my heart when I hear people express distrust of LGBT individuals who came out late in life, for example, after a heterosexual marriage. People will say things like, how could they not have known all this time? Are they sure that they're really gay? Just imagine how it feels to hear that from someone that you just came out to. But the plain truth is that gender and sexual development show a lot more variability than most people realize. And that variability often leads to change over time in sexual attractions. National and international studies conducted by researchers at Cornell, the Harvard School of Public Health, the University of Virginia, and many others have collectively tracked tens of thousands of individuals for 5, 10, 15 years. And guess what? Sexual attractions show a fair amount of fluidity. Some individuals start out exclusively attracted to one gender, and over time they find themselves attracted to both genders, or vice versa. Some bisexual individuals shift from being more drawn to one gender to being more drawn to the other. Now, what does this fluidity tell us about the innateness of sexual orientation? Nothing. Nothing at all, because they're completely unrelated. There is, to be sure, strong evidence for genetic contributions to sexual orientation, But those contributions do not cement your entire sexual lifespan from birth. What they do is push its development in a certain direction. If sexuality were totally locked down by genes, well, then if you had two identical twins and one twin was gay, the other twin would be gay 100% of the time. Because
All right, so just to jet in right here. So what she's describing, you might know sounds familiar as we've been talking about developmental cascades. So different aspects of things in the lifespan, genes, environment, hormones, things like that over the course of the lifespan lead to a lot more fluidity essentially in people's gender identity, in people's sexual orientation, and who they're attracted to. So essentially that's what we've found over more recent research, is that there is a lot more fluidity, and as well as someone throughout life. Usually when I talk about developmental cascades, I give the examples. Usually I'm talking about risk and protective factors. So I'm talking about like good things on this side that protective factors lead to, or optimal development, and then on this side, non-optimal development caused by a lot of risk factors. But with sexual orientation, it actually turns out that that kind of fluidity, that those kinds of cascades continue on throughout life, or essentially as far as we've studied within the lifespan. So just like she said, you could think of that same cascade as a sexual orientation spectrum. Maybe you have heterosexual and then bisexual and homosexual on one side. It's probably not the best way to make that line, but essentially you might be in one place at one time and then shift over a little bit to other places on that spectrum. So that's what the research is showing. And yeah, I'll let her continue to describe the research. But hopefully that's making that connection with developmental cascades, because this is a topic we've talked about quite a few times.
they have the same genes. But in reality, twin studies have found that if you have two identical twins and one twin is gay, the other twin is gay 30 to 40% of the time. Now, that is way higher than you would expect by chance alone. So it is definite evidence that your genes influence your sexual orientation. But your genes do not provide the last word on every sexual feeling you're ever going to have. Now, before moving on, I want to make one thing crystal clear. The fact that sexuality can be fluid does not mean that therapists can cure individuals of same-sex attractions. That's sometimes called conversion therapy, and study after study has shown that it does not work, and it does immense psychological damage, increasing rates of depression, anxiety, suicide attempts. That's why conversion therapy has been discredited by all of these major medical and psychological associations. And it's why all of these former practitioners of conversion therapy have not only shut their own doors, but have publicly apologized to the LGBT community and have joined legal efforts to ban the use of conversion therapy with children and adolescents.
So those are the main points I wanted to get to from this video. You can definitely feel free to watch that on your own time and see the other points. The fact that it's not legally necessary to have the born this way argument. So those are really good, especially if you're interested in the topic. For us, the main thing I wanted to focus on was the scientific accuracy of that argument. So hopefully now you understand a little bit better that just reducing it down to being born this way isn't the exact correct thing to say from a scientific perspective. Hopefully we get just general lay people to understand this a lot better in the future. So I definitely see the utility of using the born this way argument, because you're probably not going to sit down and have a 30-minute lecture with someone like in passing about sexual orientation like we've had the opportunity to do here in this class. So there's a lot of components that go into sexual orientation. It's fluid more throughout life than we originally considered it to be. We figured even 20 years ago, the idea, maybe even a little more recent than that, the idea was you developed up to your sexual orientation and that's how it stayed. But really, you develop to your sexual orientation and that can change later on. You might see some parallels with that with general identity development that we'll talk about a little bit later today. So questions about that? This might be some new concepts that you haven't heard about before. So questions, go for it. Examples of people that you know who maybe realize that later on in life, like she mentioned in the beginning of the video, that can lead to a lot more stigma for a person, questioning, hey, are they really gay? Do they really know this about themselves? So if not, no problem. We can, yeah, go for it, Daniela.
I had a friend that I worked with. Once I met, like when I met her, she had a woman partner, but she had been married to a guy before, and she had like 2 daughters. And she stayed with that woman, I think, for 11 years. And then the woman cheated on her and left her. And then she started dating a guy and got married to him. So she kept like changing. And now she's super happy.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely can't tell you what that person's orientation is. They would definitely be the right person to ask about their own orientation. They might identify as bisexual. They're just like we heard there. They might have had this same process happen of this fluidity that they did feel at that time. Then they were heterosexual, like in their own heart, I guess you could think of it that way. And then they realized that no, they did like women, and then they had that relationship for that long, and then so it can be fluid like that. If you ask this person at those different times in their life, they might have said they were heterosexual, or that they were lesbian, or that they were heterosexual again, or they might identify as bisexual. So this is not an uncommon thing for people, I guess. It's not something that we necessarily see as often, is people making that, I don't know, you might say dramatic of a shift. But also remember that there's probably only about 7%, 5, 7, 10% of the population that is LGBTQ+. So it might just be that we as individuals don't know as many people who are having this experience. So hopefully this is changing your perspectives for all students, that sexual orientation is a lot more fluid than maybe we originally came to this class with the idea of. So hopefully that helps answer your question. But you've still got your hand up, so go for it. So Daniela, if you still had a comment or question in addition to that.
Sorry, I didn't notice. No, I don't have it.
No, that's no problem. So hopefully that helps, though.
Yeah.
Basically, the research is showing that that's not an uncommon thing to have those kinds of shifts over time. We've got a comment here. So my sister has been a great example of gender fluidity. I do wish the recordings got the comments, but sometimes it wouldn't be useful when I'm just like typing, hey, can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. So, but in this kind of case, it could be useful. So my sister's been a great example of gender fluidity. She was heterosexual in high school and doubted herself in that role, then in a lesbian relationship for many years, and now with a man 20 years older than her. Her reasoning is that she is with whoever she loves, regardless of gender. So yeah, that's a really good example. So that changing in time, or maybe now looking back and having it all see, oh, I was always this way, or re-identifying. That's not uncommon with identity. So feeling like you're this way, realizing you have attractions, testing those things out, realizing that you're this way, and then later on reanalyzing again and saying, oh, I was actually really consistent in this way, in that maybe I was loving and with whoever I loved overall. So we've got another comment from Quinn. Go for it.
I just wanted to conjecture a little bit that like gender fluidity and sexual orientation would be a little different. Like I don't know. I think they're just, separate things. And I wanted to make sure that that's clear.
Yeah, definitely. So sorry if I know sometimes I say the wrong words for things, so mix up terms. I do this for basically all psych terms. So, but definitely an important thing in this sphere for sure, because gender identity is one separate thing from sexual orientation. So there's gender identity, and it's not the same as a sexual orientation. The sexual orientation is the person or the kinds of people that you're attracted to, versus gender identity is your own specific identity of who you are and what your gender is, whether it's agender, or any of the genders. So they are two separate things, but both of them do have this kind of fluidity that we can see over the lifespan. So that's the thing that's similar between them, is that they both are on these developmental cascades. But right here, most of what we're talking about has been sexual orientation. So the people that you're attracted to, who you want to engage with sexual behaviors with. So I know some of the examples in the video there were giving some examples of gender identity, but most of them were sexual orientation. So thank you for that clarification, because I know sometimes we equate them together and they're not. So is there anything else you would like to say about that in clarification, or even addition, or changes from what I said as well?
No, I think that makes sense. And it is confusing. I just feel like it's important. Actually, the person that you showed the video of, my partner is a PhD student with that person, so I have some inside.
Oh, yeah, nice.
Just information, I guess, or it feels like.
Yeah, for sure. I think it'd be, one, she's a really good presenter. She keeps people engaged and can explain it down to a really basic level. So I think that's really helpful too. So I would really be interested in hearing more of the stories that she's seen in research. One of the ones that I thought was really interesting, and this is maybe tangential, but there was a person that she was following for years and years and had never mentioned any attraction to females. But then one day she reported that she was attracted to a female, and she didn't really know where that came from. And so at the time, this researcher didn't, because it was one of those journaling entries. So this researcher couldn't immediately go and ask, hey, what was happening in this situation? But she was really curious about that. So I also found that really interesting to see this kind of fluidity, how even for someone who had been so consistent for so many years, wasn't always that consistent. So maybe a little tangential, but. All right, well, thank you for your questions and your comments and additions to this subject. It is something that, hopefully we can get just lay people and people that we talk to just in a day-to-day basis to understand these kind of developmental cascades across development, but especially with something like sexual orientation. I think it can be really helpful. They're not that difficult of concepts, but they are usually pretty new for people to hear and hear some of the evidence for. So I think it can help us understand and accept people for who they are and where they are as well, and realize that there's a lot of variation in humans, more variation than we might even consider. So let's move on to sleep. We'll go through this one really quickly because I definitely want to get into chapter 10 and talk about identity more generally and identity development. But this was mentioned in the video we watched last time, that adolescents are generally not getting enough sleep. Their melatonin releases a lot later than adults or children, and so they should probably be going to bed closer to midnight and waking up closer to 8 or 9 in the morning. So with that, having less sleep than you need is related to things like depression, poor cognitive performance, more delinquency, a harder time understanding the material in school. I remember when I was in high school, I had a really early class, and I also was going to bed at around midnight. So it ended up being that basically right after lunch, I would be falling asleep every day, even though it was one of my favorite classes. It was physics. I was really interested in the material. I just could not stay awake. So even though it was something I was really interested in, I ended up getting a C in that class versus because of my interest, I would have expected that I would get an A in that class. Also, it might have been that I'm not that great at math. That's why I'm glad my stats are done by a computer. I say, hey, run this math, and it does it. So advanced calculators. So with that, adolescents should be sleeping around 9 hours and 25 minutes, which seems like a lot more than they're generally getting. Generally, a lot of people after childhood are not getting as much sleep as they need. Older adolescents secrete the melatonin later on, so they should be going to bed around midnight. So school should start later. 8:30, even 9 a.m. would probably be better start times, and even that might still be a little too early for a lot of adolescents in late adolescence. So with that being said, who thinks that they had the earliest school start time? So put in the comments what your school start time is if you think yours was the earliest. So we've got 7:15. Anyone beat 7:15? That is incredibly early. Yeah, 7:15 tends to be about the earliest I see. In one class, I had a student that 7:05 was the time their classes actually started. So like a first bell would ring at 7, and then 7:05 they were supposed to be in classes. But yeah, 7:15 is really early, especially for an adolescent who should probably still be asleep at that time. So they're going to after school activities, hanging out with friends, doing whatever they want to do as well with their free time, and probably going to bed at midnight or even later than that. And then waking up this early to get to school at that time, especially if they have to do something like ride the bus. It's a really early time, and it's not great for cognitive development. It's not great for learning processes. It's really interesting seeing schools that, like a whole school district, basically tries to push back all their high school start times. The results from those studies show that problem behaviors like delinquency go way down, academics all go way up, so just by pushing back the start times. So, and then we've got Andrew did symphony for junior and senior year, and that started at 6:30. Yeah, so those early, I had 1 year I did band, and we did the same thing. For marching band, we came in at 6:30 to get it done before school started. So yeah, that is really hard for adolescents. So the main point here is maybe we should think about what adolescents need developmentally and kind of structure the world around them better. It's a hard thing because you have parents who want their kids in school at a specific time so that they can maybe get off to work and come back home and get kids to activities. Maybe there's a high school kid, a middle school kid, an elementary school kid in a family. They all have different schedules. It can be very confusing and a lot more difficult for parents, for the administration who run the school, for the adults who are teachers as well. So their sleep cycle is probably good for starting at 8:30. When we start this class, for example, that's probably a little better for me biologically than some of you students. One good thing about college is you can kind of pick the times that you take a class, so that's a benefit as well. But yeah, so the school start times in Brazil were from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. because most of the students had to work during the day. Yeah, and that wouldn't actually be a bad time. For 11 p.m. might seem really late, but for an adolescent, that isn't that bad. Generally, people tend to learn better right after they wake up. So switching that around, so if they were working during that time, but that doesn't work with a lot of businesses and other people being around and doing things. So that's really interesting, though, that the high school was going from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. That was actually probably pretty good for the adolescents, for them learning. So with this exercise, 60 minutes a day of moderate to vigorous activity. Good exercise leads to good exercise practices in the future. Good blood pressure, less risk factors of dying early. There's a lot of detail here on eating disorders. One of the things that's common between them is a preoccupation with food, their body image, and their weight. So they each are a little bit different, but we're actually going to mostly skip over these. For them, basically cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the best kinds of treatments for all of these eating disorders. It is harder to catch some of them than others. Bulimia, for example, you're binging and then purging. So getting some nutrients, it tends to keep your body looking a little more healthy rather than with anorexia, just keeping any food away. Essentially, you will, as an outside observer, you might notice that a person's looking very, very small. So it's actually sometimes a lot harder to detect bulimia. So adolescent cognition, adolescents now can form abstract thoughts, but with this, adolescents do often have idealistic thinking, and that contributes to their own identity processes, thinking about who they are. It contributes, as we'll see, to their socio-emotional relationships with things like parents. They might have kind of an idealized view of what a parent should be like, and when their parents don't match up to that, it can cause some problems. But Piaget's observations at this stage were really useful. One thing that I wanted to mention was adolescent egocentrism. They have this heightened self-consciousness. So here's a little comic that kind of displays this. So this student is wondering if everybody is looking at them and if everybody can see maybe a blemish on their face. Interestingly, as we study adolescents, all these adolescents are thinking that same thing. So while they might all be thinking that other people are looking at them or thinking about them, the other ones are thinking the same thing, that everybody's looking at them or thinking about them. So this is a really common component. So they have these two features of this egocentrism, and I'm not saying egocentrism as, say, a negative, that they are intentionally thinking only about themselves. This is a developmental phenomenon with the changes in cognition, with the changes in identity, with their concern with how they're being viewed around their peers. This is a normative aspect of development. Adolescents tend to imagine an audience, that people are watching them, that people are concerned with what they're doing, that they're judging them. And sometimes that might be the case, but it's not as often as adolescents tend to believe it is. And a personal fable about who they are and how people see them. So personal fable is also this idea that they are very unique and invincible. This also is related to things like risk-taking and their emotion centers of their brain. So also adolescents often believe that people can't understand necessarily how they feel. And this also might be a feature of having adults studying adolescents. The adolescents don't believe the adult can know how they feel, and on some level they might be accurate in that. But these are two aspects of that, this imaginary audience and personal fable, that can actually make it really difficult to help adolescents in a lot of ways. If an adolescent is struggling with depression, bulimia, anything, not feeling like people can understand you can make it difficult to give them support, to give them help. Even if it's a teacher or a mentor or someone, it can be difficult to get through these ideas of imaginary audience and personal fable. So one thing to do is think about, how can we help adolescents who are thinking this way, who have this sense of uniqueness or invincibility that other people can't understand what they're going through? How can you still get through to support these adolescents? So, all right. Executive functioning is improving. Hopefully you can see this as a pattern across time. Executive functioning, the functions of the prefrontal cortex are getting better, especially in adolescence. The ability to set goals becomes a lot better, a lot more clear. Adolescents, especially towards later adolescence, can set long-term goals, have it affect their short-term goals, do a lot better job of that. They're getting better with their cognitive flexibility at responding to, especially towards later adolescence, responding to emotions. So in early adolescence, emotions can be really difficult to control, versus later adolescence, they've had some more experience with that now. The myelin is happening, getting more of that prefrontal cortex hooked up. So decision making is improving. So a 12-year or a 12th grader is going to do a better job at like goal setting, decision making, debating the pros and cons of things than an 8th grader, and an 8th grader is going to do better than a 5th grader. So it's kind of the developmental trajectory for that. I know I'm kind of speeding through this, so if you have questions on any of this, please definitely ask me. Your book goes into some detail on this, but since we're spending so much time on some of these really important subjects, some of these other ones I am just going to breeze over. So what kind of real world decisions are adolescents from, say, 15 to 19? What kind of real world decisions are they facing? We've got a good comment here, what college they're planning to go to, or if they're planning to go to college, if they want to do a trade, if they want to go straight into the workforce. Yeah, that's a pretty big life decision that's generally happening in adolescence. Peer pressure decisions. Yeah, so depending on your group, they might be pressuring you to do any kind of behavior. So there are those kinds of decisions that could have impacts on your future life. Pregnancy, for example, could have a really big impact on the rest of your life, having a child that age. Any other real world decisions you can think of? A job, yeah, whether they're going to seek out a job, what kind of job, who to network with, these kinds of things, if they should drive. Really good comments. Also, relationship decisions, who are they going to date or not date, things like this. What kind of peer groups are they going to be involved with? Those are the kind of real world decisions adolescents are facing. So these are big decisions. For some people, their same friend group in high school might be the same friend group they have into middle and late adulthood, or not. It depends on their decisions and also the relationships with those friends, right? So, oh, sorry about that. Didn't turn my phone on silent. Good song, though. So with this, critical thinking is improving. Oh, another big piece is the transition from adolescence into adulthood, and the transition from middle to high school as well. So middle to high school, many things are changing in between middle school and high school. Puberty is happening, family and peer relationships are changing. You might not have the same friends in your high school as you had in your middle school. So some of them might be going to another high school rather than the same. You might be getting new peers that weren't in your middle school. So the context with parents changes too. So there's a little more flexibility in, say, high school for like choosing your classes and things like that, giving adolescents a little more responsibility. So that's a change for parents as well. We've hit a lot of these topics in previous, talking about late childhood as well. Service learning is one thing that really increases in frequency in adolescents and in high schools. So service learning is like programs where a student will go out into the community, maybe volunteer at a vet or something like that. So there's a lot more service learning done for adolescents in high school than in middle school or elementary school. It is in places where it's done in middle school, it shows a lot of positives. It shows they get a lot more self-efficacy by being able to see, even in middle school as well as high school, that they can contribute something to the world beyond themselves. They get out of that bubble of the school, maybe make other friends rather than just in that context of the school. Because in a lot of ways, especially public school settings, the public school kind of becomes their only or one of their most important contexts in adolescence. So much of what they do goes through that filter of school. Your sports teams, your clubs are all centered around school. So doing service learning, getting out in the community, doing things, other things, even just being involved in clubs really helps open up those contexts and options. Yeah, so also religious commitments as well, back to decisions adolescents are making. So religious commitments, whether they will, for example, here, if they're going on a mission, if they're LDS, or any other kind of religious commitments, are they going to stick with the same religion as their parents as they move off into college or not? So a lot of aspects of that. So I definitely wanted to get to chapter 10 a little earlier, but I think we've had some really good discussions in chapter 9. There's just a lot of things that happen in adolescence. So I'm sorry about that. So one of the biggest things I wanted to focus on is, actually, how much time do we have? We've got till 9:50, right? Yep. Okay, we've got enough time to talk about identity development. So this is definitely very related to sexual identity, but identity development here, we're talking about general identity. So it includes sexual orientation, but it's not exclusively just that. So one of the best ways to study adolescent identity is to use narrative approaches. So this is a qualitative method where essentially a researcher will sit down with an adolescent and ask them to tell them about their life, tell them stories about their life. What's a really good thing that happened in their life, a really bad thing that happened in their life? Where do they see themselves in 5 years? So basically have the adolescent talking to them, then being able to pick out over time, doing these kind of interviews multiple times, who that adolescent is, and the adolescent also figures out who they are and how they came to be that way. So with that, Erikson talked about an identity crisis, that the socio-emotional developmental feature right here was identity crisis. The idea here was that you have to decide who you are and what you are about before you can move on to adult stages of cognitive ability, adult stages of socio-emotional relationships. And so while Erikson was right that identity is a big key piece here in adolescence, it's not a crisis as much as Erikson tried to make it. If you don't figure out your identity in adolescence, one thing that we found is that the first time adolescents feel like they have a good sense of their identity is actually between about 17 and 25. So this happens a little later than Erikson generally thought. The figuring out and being able to put a name or a clear idea of what your identity is. So these are the kind of questions that adolescents are often asking themselves is who are they? What are they doing with their life? So with this, they're doing a lot of different things to figure that out. Role experimentation, they're going to try out different roles. Maybe they try out a job, or they try out more things in their religious context, or try out different clubs, try out different sports, jump in with a different group of friends. Try being a leader versus not, things like that. They try out different roles to see if it fits who they are or who they feel they are. Their vocation as well. What kind of job are they going to do? They try a club where they're doing robotics and engineering, or they try doing music, just as a couple examples. What are their spiritual beliefs? In adolescence, they're thinking more about this, trying to, again, decide in the future, who are they going to be, as well as sexual identity. So sexual identity is one piece of this, one component. But a lot of the development there, we've already talked about, will parallel a lot of the development of identity generally as well. So what is the definition of identity? I keep using that word, but I haven't really defined it yet. So I think this is the best definition that I found. It's a more recent definition as well to, say, Erikson's definition. And I think it incorporates a lot of the components of identity that are important. So I'm actually going to read this one to you. So identity is the sameness and continuity of a person's psychological functioning, their interpersonal behavior, and commitments to roles, values, and beliefs. So all of those components, their beliefs, their values, their own roles that they're testing out in adolescence, their interpersonal behavior, who they are with peers, friends, family members, and their psychological functioning as well. So what that includes is basically a lot of things. maybe their political identity, their vocation or what kind of job they want to do, their religious identity, their relationship identity, their sexual identity, their gender identity, their culture and ethnic identity. That's one that we haven't even mentioned yet, but cultural and ethnic identity is also a big part of a person's overall identity development. And then their interests. What are their interests? And then are those going to stay the same? So this is the definition of identity. These are the things that it includes. As we talked about, sexual orientation or sexual identity might even be figured out earlier, and gender identity is probably figured out and settled on is probably the incorrect word, but might happen even earlier than that as well. And then, as we've talked about, both those things can be fluid. So you might guess from talking about developmental cascades, even though we're generally setting on an identity sometime between the ages of 17 and 25, it still is actually a lot more fluid than Erikson ever thought. So the idea was you figure out your identity and then you move on to an adulthood with that identity, and that's who you are the rest of your life. In reality, we're finding out, and we have found out, that identity changes a whole lot. It's much more fluid. It's not nearly as consistent as we originally thought. Honestly, to me, that's really exciting. Seeing the change in people over time, it would be really boring, I think, to think that I had my identity and it would never change. I would always be exactly the same person. And for some individuals, that might sound great, and that might be exactly the path they take through life. But let's talk about the development of identity through time. So in infancy, we've talked about attachment. Hopefully you remember that. It's been on exams as well. So that is the first step in developing an identity, a sense of self, realizing that you are different than other people, that you have your own interests and things that you like and care about. Then getting more independence in late childhood, being able to make choices and do things in a community, for example. Hopefully, the recording is still going. It's giving me a lot of notifications. I think it might have just died and come back though. Then self-concept in the late childhood and early teens, figuring out a concept of yourself, these general ideas, starting off really concrete, getting more abstract as time goes on. I'm hearing notifications on my phone. Sorry about this. Maybe it just now is sending me the same messages that have been put in the class chat. And then in adolescence, this kind of all coalesces into an identity, looking back on the similarities between yourself, how you're the same across contexts or different across contexts, and figuring out this is my identity. Again, that generally happens sometime between 17 and 25, so later than Erikson thought. And then in adulthood, identity changes even still. So one example for me is becoming a father had a dramatic impact on my change of identity. My brother actually had a child just a couple days ago, and so seeing now him transitioning into that role of being a father is really interesting to kind of be able to watch that change in his identity. That's one example, kind of a more dramatic example. Doesn't have to be necessarily having a child is the only thing. And then in late adulthood, reviewing and integrating. So thinking back on your life, being able to pick out those consistent pieces of your identity. Maybe you feel that's the most important, or maybe the changes that have happened in your identity are really important to you. Maybe all of it's really important. So all through adulthood, people can change their identity. And this is a big change from what we thought even a few decades ago about identity. Identity is not settled on and then the same throughout adulthood. People change their identity still, even though the first time we essentially call it identity is in adolescence. So you start off in about middle childhood with your self-concept. Then you're in a bunch of different contexts. You've got your family context, you've got your community context, you've got your peers, and you can see how you behave with those people, how you behave consistently, how you might be behaving inconsistently. In adolescence, you might try to be more consistent with yourself, for example. That tends to be the pattern. And then once you see this kind of consistency across contexts, you might realize, oh, this is pretty much who I am. I do X, Y, and Z across all these kinds of things. I'm this kind of person across these kind of scenarios. So that's in early to middle adolescence. And then when you see that kind of consistency, you come to it and you decide that that is your identity. You might not even have like a conversation with yourself where you do that. But seeing those consistent aspects of yourself, it goes into people realizing who they feel they are. But then again, in adulthood, that can still change. So I think that is a really exciting aspect of developmental psychology, is studying those changes over time. And I think it's also really optimistic about humans as well, that humans can change, can thrive, can improve all throughout life. If there's something about a person's identity that they don't like, they can intentionally change that. Different life experiences can change people. So these are maybe obvious concepts, but something that research took a little while to catch on to. So again, anywhere in between about 17 and 25 is where that settling on that identity is really happening. So with that, it's not just one crisis in adolescence, figuring out your identity. It's a continuous process from infancy all the way up through adolescence, and then with still fluidity in adulthood. So whatever identity you have now and how you see yourself now today might be a little different than how you see yourself in 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now as well. And that is very normal and very appropriate, and also I think exciting to see how people do change, how maybe I will change in the future. So that first point where we call it identity is in adolescence, and then we just talk about it being fluid throughout the rest of adulthood. So some examples of how identity might change. So here in high school, maybe you feel like, I don't know, what would this group be called? What would they call themselves? It looks like they're all reading books. So maybe your identity is that you're a nerd, or maybe you're a sports person. And then later on, maybe you're in college and you realize you really like certain subjects. So that becomes part of your identity. Maybe you get a career. Maybe you're a teacher and that's part of your identity. Maybe you change careers later on in life. Maybe you have multiple changes of careers. Each time you do that, it might have an impact on your identity. You have children, that might have an impact on your identity. You have grandchildren, that might have an impact on your identity as well. So different aspects of these might be more core or more central to you as part of your identity. Yeah, people are complex, made up of a bunch of different things, and those things can be changeable or fluid or dynamic over time. Some things more than others, some things less than others. But I think that's the exciting thing about development, is exploring those things. So, yeah. So when an adolescent gets to that point where they have a feeling that they have an identity, we call that identity achievement, or they've achieved getting to their identity. And so if you have identity achievement, if you feel like you have a clear picture of who you are, generally people who have that are more satisfied with their life. They have more self-understanding, they have more independent critical thought because they understand themselves in relation to the world maybe a little bit better, and they have an awareness of their place in the world. So what do you think are things that parents can do to support identity development? So your comments can be about in early adolescence, middle adolescence, late adolescence, even adulthood or childhood. What are some things parents can do to support this process of figuring out your identity? Yeah, that is one of the best, is allowing adolescent kids to experiment. So letting them try out new and different things, encouraging that, giving the opportunities to try out new and different things, to experiment with all sorts of things. So you can experiment with different instruments and music. You can experiment with different kinds of vocations. You can experiment with different kinds of sexual orientations. You can experiment with different kinds of roles within your family, maybe more of a leader, or you're taking more charge or taking less charge. So yeah, experimenting and allowing that space and even providing that space is one of the biggest things. So Andrew's comment is really similar: provide opportunity to pursue diverse things. So another example, I mentioned like music and sports, providing them funds to do a music class or a sports team, things like that, and support their decision making. and also changing a decision. So support the decision making, but also if they change their decisions. Yeah. So this is a big challenge oftentimes with adults, and we'll talk about it a little more when we get to talking about adulthood with parenting. But parents can have a challenging time giving children, late children, adolescents more freedom than they had before. So, I mean, I'm a parent. It didn't come with a rule book. I have developmental textbooks, and I use those sometimes to help. But it can be really hard to figure out what is the balance of giving responsibility and space to make decisions and respect for those decisions that a child, an adolescent, or late child is doing. Encouraging open conversation. Yep. So all those are pretty much the biggest things that parents can do to support identity development. Allowing experimenting, providing opportunities to do diverse things, supporting their decisions, letting them be responsible, and open conversation are some of the biggest things to do to support identity development. One big thing for the communication gives a good opportunity to see if a person has been consistent over time by having that sounding board of a parent. Conflict resolution and interpersonal relationship skills can really help too. So this goes back to a lot of the socio-emotional learning we've talked about throughout the course. Is those kind of interpersonal skills, they'll really help in figuring out your identity as well. So having a secure attachment is more likely that you'll be identity achieved. So generally, parents who have a specific attachment style and specific parenting style are going to be consistent in doing that over time. So the same kind of behaviors as being a secure base and allowing exploration kind of age that up to a high school level. The parent's still a secure base to come back to, but they can also go and explore and try out different diverse things and experiment. So if you have different attachment styles to parents, so if you're not securely attached to parents, you can definitely still find identity. It's just a little easier within the context for someone who's securely attached. So how about friends? How can close friends support identity development? Excuse me. So again, this can be probably adolescence, but it can also be childhood or even early adulthood. Or even think back to things that you did maybe with peers or are doing currently with peers that you think are helping them figure out who they are, or maybe that they've even mentioned was really helpful. Yeah, that's a really good one. So exploring activities together. So doing things that you both like, or if one of your friends is interested in something, encourage them, even support them in doing those things. So that can be a really big thing, is exploring diverse activities together. Other ideas? I'm glad there are so many good ideas for what parents can do, but I think sometimes we just, as a society, don't talk about how much friends can also do, especially at the adolescent stage. So having quality friendships and having that safe environment acts in a very similar way. Yeah, the parents and the family of those friends. Yeah, and just talking about things. So having people that you can go to, close relationships, quality friendships, whether it's kind of a mentor relationship or maybe it's a friend, a peer that's like on your same level on things, having that safe place can give you more options to go and test out different things, test out the diversity of roles and experiences that you might want to test. Romantic relationships specifically can be a good one for this as well. You can explore together. Again, this is generally better when you have a secure romantic relationship, so a secure attachment there. But a lot of the same functions that parents can serve for adolescents exploring identity, peers and other friends can serve those same functions too. So interestingly, in adolescence, quite a few aspects of it. So we hear about peer pressure in adolescence, but we don't really hear about peer pressure for 30-year-olds or 10-year-olds as much. That's because peers become such an important part of a context for an adolescent that they can, in some ways, overtake the responsibility of a parent in the development of an adolescent. So, I definitely want to talk about ethnic identity, but I thought there was a little graph I had here that showed this one. This is what I wanted to show. So in for self-disclosing conversations, for those for that intimacy, sharing things about self, having other people share those things about themselves as well, those kind of intimate conversations increase a lot between friends and decrease a lot between parents as we get into adolescence. So you can see here that in grade school, generally parents are talked to more, and then around middle school time, it's starting to switch. Then by adolescence, when they're searching for their identity and trying to get that identity achievement, in general, friends have a lot more intimacy with each other than a parent and their child. So the child is not letting the parent know as much about themselves, their hopes, their dreams, than they are with their friends. And so that's one reason that peer relationships can be so shaping for adolescent identity going forward. So definitely didn't want to skip over all of this, but I did want to show that graph there. All right, so let's talk about ethnic identity, because it's definitely something that we haven't really touched on yet. And one of the things here is that ethnic identity is a difficult topic because even the researchers are still kind of debating the definition. So let's talk about it really quickly.
The definition of ethnic identity is complicated. If you ask different scholars, they'll tell you different definitions for what ethnic identity means. One way of defining ethnic identity is the degree to which someone feels a sense of belonging to their ethnic group, and the degree to which that sense of belonging has been achieved through exploration. So how much has that person tried to learn about his or her ethnic background, and then, through that process of exploring and learning about your ethnic background, then how is it that you feel about how much you belong to that group? So that's one way to define ethnic identity, and in my research, that's how I define it typically, just trying to examine how much adolescents specifically have explored their ethnicity, either through talking to other people about it, through reading books, getting other materials and learning about it through reading, magazines, things like that, attending festivals, anything like that, listening to music. There's a lot of different ways that you can learn about your ethnicity. Another way that people define ethnic identity would be the degree to which a person has acculturated or has not acculturated. So if a person has adopted a lot of the values and traditions of the mainstream culture or the majority culture, then that person is thought to have a lower ethnic identity because they're associating themselves more with mainstream or majority culture compared to someone who maybe is not adopting those cultural values or traditions and is really hanging on to their own values. So it's very complicated trying to come up with a definition of ethnic identity. But depending on what school of thought you're following, whether it's sociology, whether it's psychology, human development, you can get an idea of how ethnic identity will be defined. Different people will have different ideas about how ethnic identity.
So hopefully that gives you some sense of the state of the field there. When we don't have a clear definition of the construct to begin with, when we're still kind of debating that, it can be hard to then go out and measure that, because if you have one definition, other researchers have another, that makes it a little more difficult. It's good to have an operational definition that everyone agrees upon, but those are both really overlapping things in these two definitions. So it's worked out fairly well still, even though the definition still doesn't have an agreement. And I'm sure that's very frustrating for people in that field. I've got slight disagreements in definitions within like pro-social behavior and altruism and things like that. And it's even less dramatic definition differences than these. But essentially, we'll talk about it as this enduring aspect of yourself as a member of an ethnic group and your feelings about that membership. So do you feel like you actually do belong in that group, or do you not belong in that group, or do you belong more to the majority cultures group? So in the US, the process of developing ethnic identity is actually really similar for people of many different ethnicities. So especially ethnic minorities, they're going through very similar shared experiences, even though they might be developing very different ethnic identities. So obviously the specific individual experiences are going to be different for any person, but the overall patterns are surprisingly similar. So it also is a protective factor for a lot of psychological functions to have a strong ethnic identity. So in the context of identity in general, remember this, we're talking about this in the sense of an adolescent. They're exploring their ethnic identity. They're comparing what their parents' ethnic identities are, what their parents did, what their grandparents did maybe, the cultural values that they have, what things they want to take on and share and continue on in the future. And that might change into adulthood. Maybe when they have children, they say, oh, I really liked these kinds of things that my parents did, and so they bring in other aspects of this ethnic identity at different points in the lifespan as well. So some things that might affect the development of ethnic identity is whether a person is an immigrant or not an immigrant. Are they a refugee or not a refugee? Are they first generation or second generation or third generation? So all these things might impact their ethnic identity, the development of their ethnic identity, how salient, so like how clear the ethnicity that their family came from is to them. If they're third generation, it might not be as salient to them as if they're first generation. So the reception of their group in the US. So with that, there's a lot of systematic discrimination and racism, recent and not recent. So if you're a member of an ethnic group that really recently has had a lot of discrimination, that's going to affect the development of your ethnic identity versus if, and probably be more salient than if your group was systematically discriminated against hundreds of years ago, for example. So an example of that, especially since we just had St. Patrick's Day yesterday, is the Irish were discriminated against, but not as much recently. So, or not as broadly, not as systematically as recently. So that might be less of an impact on the development of your ethnic identity there. So with that, I think ethnic identity is probably the last piece I want to talk about. I do want to go back to the general identity development slide. So this one. So hopefully you can see, as we've been talking about these different aspects of identity, sexual orientation as part of an identity, ethnic identity, things that you're concerned with like vocations, schooling, values, and how these all kind of continue on from what we've been talking about in early childhood with self-concept. And across these different contexts, looking at the similarities or differences of how you behave or what you feel is important or who you are in different scenarios, and seeing that consistency to get to that achievement of identity. So, and with that, it's, even though previous research would suggest that you get to that point and you stay the same, more recent research shows that that's a lot more fluid over time. So hopefully this is kind of one of the big aspects of research in adolescence. So hopefully it's a lot more clear to you and shows that there's a lot more to be done and a lot of change to be investigated in identity as well. But yeah, thanks for being here today, and thanks for the discussion in the comments as well. I will see you again on Tuesday. Have a good weekend.